draft time, baby, and we have everything you need to know about the 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft and what it means for fantasy rugby. The Fantasy Ruckers show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 31 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thanks so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. And oh boy, do we have a jam-packed episode for you today. It's all about this week's 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft. Yes, it is happening this week, Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to find out who the next upcoming stars of the MLR are going to be, and more importantly, what impact they are going to have in the world of fantasy rugby. Man, I can't wait to find out all of that. But before we get into that, we need to know what this draft is all about. How does it work? What are the teams going to do? What's the landscape like? Who are the players that we need to look out for? We are going to drop and talk all about that in this episode to get you all prepared for Thursday's draft. I'm Ryan Yee. Thanks again for joining us. You might notice if you're watching on our YouTube channel, you may not have heard the snarky comments or the snarky jokes yet that we usually hear at the top of the show. Devin Vanderpool, Matt Yee are not with us on this episode. I think they're a little bit too busy right now trying to get all of their notes put together, figure out how this draft is going to impact their fantasy season. They're hard at work. They're using those sticky notes now after John, our past league winner, gave them a few pointers about keeping those notes and using all of the information that they can get to have a successful fantasy season. So I'm sure they're doing all that with this 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft, but it's okay. I got everything that you need to know. We're going to break it down in this episode. A little bit of housekeeping stuff to start off, though. If you aren't following us yet, make sure you're doing so on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers on Instagram, Fantasy Ruckers on Twitter. You can also join our Discord channel. The link for that is down below. That's where you're going to find out all the latest happenings with Fantasy MLR and how we're growing fantasy rugby within the league. We're really trying to expand this thing. We've been breaking stuff down. We've been giving you the good stats. And now we want to open it up so that more people can experience the amazing season that we had last year and just, give you guys a different way of digesting the MLR, because that's what it's all about. We can never get enough MLR content, and it's for sure added to a very exciting offseason as well. So yeah, on social media, that's where you'll find out how maybe if a position opens up in one of our leagues, if we do end up expanding to more leagues, that's where you're going to find out first. And hey, if you want to learn more about fantasy rugby in the MLR, you'll be able to find all that good stuff there as well. So make sure you are doing that. Give us a like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. We really do appreciate it. It goes a long way. And we love talking with you guys as well about fantasy rugby, because that's what we're all about here. Just trying to, like we said, make it a reality. So with that being said, let's hop right into it. We have a Ask TFR show question every single week. And of course, this week, it's going to be about the draft. I was going through the Fantasy Ruckers DMs, the comments, and all that good stuff. And I think we're going to go with a simple question here on today's episode, one that kind of intrigued me and kind of opened up the conversation about the draft and about the impact that it has, kind of an extension of what we did on last week's episode and the conversation we had about drafting and things like that. But the question that I was given this week for Ask TFR show is, what are you looking most forward to in the 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft? You might think, hey, that's an easy question to answer. It's such an open-ended, you can say anything. But I really wanted to touch on this because of that conversation that we were having on last week's episode about the importance of the draft and how other leagues around the world do operate it. And we went into an in-depth conversation, and a lot of you are big rugby fans in overseas leagues, so you guys know this already. But a large portion of rugby competitions overseas, their main format, or I should say main structure in how these leagues operate, is through youth development, through youth programs, their amateur sides, and bringing up players through those systems to eventually develop them and get them ready to hopefully one day, or at least all teams hope that their players will, that they do develop, end up performing and appearing in their senior men's squad That's usually how it operates around the world. Now, we talked about it this last episode, and we'll re-mention it here again, is that is not how the MLR works. The MLR does have that portion that they have adapted to keep that kind of fundamental feel, how typical rugby leagues do operate. But of course, we all know that there is this MLR draft that they also do to supplement these teams and maybe add a little bit of parity around the league and things like that. So a little bit of an interesting convention when it comes to the MLR of how that differs between other leagues like Super Rugby, like Top 14, like the Premiership, all these different things. We have this, in addition, dynamic of this draft, how teams can use and figure out the way to best utilize these picks in order to supplement those youth programs that they already have. Now, this leads to my answer to the question. What makes this question so intriguing and that whole operation so intriguing is that I don't think yet there is a outright strategy of how important this draft is yet to teams. We've only had a handful of these drafts since the MLR first started, and I think teams are still trying to figure out. Now, this is just a feeling that I do have. I think there are teams that value the draft way more than other teams do. Other teams, I think there are specific teams that really rely on free agent signings. Obviously, there are a lot of teams that really, emphasize the use of their youth programs. And then you got teams that are making big moves that are collecting these draft picks in hopes of getting some pretty high level talent when it comes to the 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft. So that's the first thing. I'm very interested to see how these teams value these picks, how these teams strategize these picks, how the teams really kind of operate around this draft, because I don't think yet we really have a true understanding of that, focus that teams around the MLR have. So it'll be interesting to see how they do that. And I think something that is also important, because you have this element of free agent signings and being able to bring in players, bring them through their youth programs, and not necessarily having to rely on this draft for main talent. Kind of the flip side of the token, you look at the, major sports that are in North America, they don't have youth programs like the way that rugby leagues overseas have them. You don't have these developmental programs. Yes, you do have farm teams and things like that, but not to the extent in which rugby operates overseas. A lot of the building, a lot of the rebuilding, a lot of the retooling in these major sports like hockey, football, basketball, baseball happen through these drafts. Now, the MLR is kind of that middle meeting point, and I think what's going to be interesting is how teams kind of balance the use of those two things, like I quickly mentioned. But I think more importantly is, you look at certain drafts and how certain teams approach it with team need, or do they take best player off the board, things like that. I think those kind of factors and teams on top of that whole strategy around this draft is going to be interesting. So for the concise answer to the Ask TFR Show question, I think just finding out more about how the teams utilize this draft, I think it'll be dictated and it'll be very telling with the picks that are made this Thursday on how the teams value this. I think we've really started to see it with some of the trades that we've seen among teams, trading international spots, trading salary cap rights, trading players for draft picks, things like that. We're going to get into all those roster moves in just a second here, but I think that is a little bit of an indicator of which certain teams also value the MLR Collegiate Draft. So should be pretty interesting. I'm excited to see how teams approach this. It'll be interesting to see what players end up in those spots. And yeah, we'll break it all down as well in a post-draft episode, as well as kind of mention some of the players here in this preview as well. So that is the Ask TFR Show question. If you have a question for us, you want to learn more about fantasy rugby, make sure you're using the hashtag AskTFRShow on Twitter and Instagram. We sort through those. We try to figure out the best question of the week, and we try to get you those answers in the upcoming episodes. And it's just a fun way to interact with the growing and hopefully emerging fantasy rugby community. So that is definitely something that we are trying to emphasize to get you guys involved, you the listeners, you the viewers, because you guys have been so supportive for this whole thing already. So we're going to move on here to a little bit of news and notes before we get into a little bit of a short draft preview here to get you guys prepared for the 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft. But we got to talk about some of the signings that were made this week and some of the big news that has happened. And I got to start off with the top. I think the biggest news from this past week, released on August 11th, is the announcement that USADA has given Reichert Hadding of the Seattle Seawolves a sanction, he accepts his sanction for an anti-doping rule violation that he did commit. Hadding tested positive for a drug called tamoxifen, I think is how you say it. That sample was collected on March 27th. That it is a banned substance in the class of hormone and metabolic modulators. All these big words. All you guys really need to know is that Reichert Hadding is facing a 6-month period of ineligibility that began on August 4th, 2022. So that means that his first eligible date, I believe, to return is going to be February 4th, 2023. And if the timing works out right, this suspension should not have much, if any, effect on the 2023 MLR campaign. He might miss maybe a couple weeks here and there, or maybe the start. We haven't gotten or received any solidified dates from the MLR as of yet. But when those do comes out, that is something to keep in mind, that Reichert Hadding will not be available until February 4th. Now, I should mention that this was not a guy taking steroids in order to, boost his performance on the field and trying to find a way to cheat the game, because we're not about that here at the Fantasy Ruckers, definitely. But nonetheless, Reichert Hadding was tested positive because it was tamoxifen was included in a medication that was prescribed to him through the care of a physician. I don't want to get into the whole details of the debate between, whether it lies on the player, the team, to really understand what is in the drugs and medications that you're taking. That's a whole other conversation to have. I think all of that we need to know here is that Reichert Hadding not available for the next 6 months. And again, I don't think that is going to have much effect on his fantasy rugby season in the 2023 year. Remember, this is a player for the Seattle Seawolves that collected over 70 points in the past 2022 fantasy MLR season, finishing 7th overall. He was the highest forward to finish in the entire MLR with regards to fantasy finish, with those 70.9 points. The next one coming up as not until, I believe, let me see here, way down the line in 36 for Marco Jan von Rensburg with 49.5 points. So Reichert Hadding, just a huge cheat code in this last 2022 MLR fantasy season, and we'll see whether or not this 6-month suspension has any effect on that. I don't think it will. I think we're going to see the same Reichert Hadding that we saw in 2022, but that is something that fantasy managers need to be aware of, that he may miss a little bit of time, if any, in the 2023 MLR season. Now moving on just to some quick roster moves that we need to catch up on. Kevin Sullivan re-signs with the NOLA Gold. Will Kelly is moving overseas to England National League 1 team. I believe it's pronounced the Chinnor RFC Tame team, I think, something like that. But Will Kelly is going overseas. Interesting enough, Sam Malcolm obviously is their starting fly half. The Toronto Arrows starting fly half. He just re-signed with the club, so it doesn't look like Will Kelly was going to see an ample amount of playing time, or I should say an increased amount of playing time going into the 2023 year. So he'll look to get that overseas in England. Mitch Richardson re-signs with the Toronto Arrows, and the Giltinis' Joe Tafetti, he's actually going overseas to play for the Leicester Tigers as well. So cool to see some players moving on to some higher level competitions overseas, using the MLR as a stepping stone to further their rugby career. Really, really cool. And then a final note, a good little segue here to get into what everyone has been waiting about on this episode, to really break down what this 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft is all about. We have a trade, and it was a strictly draft trade. And this is what I'm talking about when it comes to which teams really value the draft. You can kind of read between the lines when it comes to these roster moves that are being made. We've talked about the roster move with the Utah giving the service rights to James Vifali in order to acquire a second-round pick. We're talking about, certain moves like that. And the latest move is that the NOLA Gold receives DC's first-round pick. So they're picking second overall in exchange for NOLA's third overall pick and then acquiring a second round 26th overall pick as well. That is DC. So basically, the way that it all shakes out is that NOLA, in order to move to that second draft position, they're essentially paying DC a second round pick for them to take over that spot and for DC to move down one slot. So again, you can read between the lines here. Maybe there's something that NOLA really wants to make sure that they're getting at that second pick. I'm not going to reveal it just yet, but I think a lot of you listening already know who that first overall pick is going to be. So I think NOLA has a pretty good idea of who they will be selecting at that second pick. They didn't want any chance of DC stealing that pick. So we'll see whether or not, or who that player is that they're really trying to gun for in Thursday's draft, because clearly they do have someone in mind. So that's all the roster moves for this week. That was the sole draft pick swap that we saw on August 12th. So yeah, let's move along here. Let's move on to this draft and kind of give you guys a breakdown of what to expect on Thursday. And just to give you guys a little bit of a housekeeping thing for how this week is going to operate. You guys are so lucky this week when it comes to your fantasy MLR passionate fans here. You guys are getting 2 episodes this week. A little bit of a teaser here. So you're getting this one. You're listening probably to this before the Thursday's draft is happening. This is going to give you a nice little preview, everything to expect and the fantasy implications that will have. And then on Friday, we're actually going to have a special guest on the show. We're going to have Rugby Morning, one of our league members and a guy that has been putting out so much great MLR content this offseason and throughout the past season. We've been relying heavily on him with his daily morning emails that kind of give us a little bit of a refresher every day about the rugby content, not only just the MLR, but across the world that you may have missed in that 24-hour period. So again, I suggest all of you to go out there, follow at Rugby Morning on social media. And then also, if you go to rugbymorning.com, you can subscribe to that daily email for anyone that is dying for rugby content, especially during the off season of the MLR. That is definitely going to satisfy the appetite, at least just a bit, as we count down the days to that 2023 MLR year. But nonetheless, he will be joining us on the Friday show, or a show that will be coming out Friday post the draft, where we're going to break down all the selections that were made during Thursday's draft, and then also talk about the fantasy implications that they have. You know, we mentioned it in last week's episode that just because a guy was selected higher than a player that comes after him does not necessarily mean, from a fantasy perspective, that they are necessarily going to perform better. A great example of that is Vito Petty, who was not picked, you know, in the first overall pick that year was Eric Naposki, and ended up being that Vito Petty winning Rookie of the Year, beating out Eric Naposki. We went into an in-depth conversation about it last week, but just to kind of put it into a little summary here, is that a lot of it, in addition to obviously the talent that these players have that are coming into this draft, is the situation as well. And we know that in all fantasy sports. We know that in fantasy football. We know that in fantasy hockey, fantasy baseball. Just because you are, quote unquote, the best player on paper does not necessarily mean that directly translate to fantasy rugby. There's a lot of other underlying dynamics and factors that go into it that really determine how or affects how a player is going to perform throughout the course of a fantasy season. So that is something to keep in mind. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about that on Friday's episode. Rugby Morning is going to give me a little bit of help here. I know that he's been really diving into this collegiate draft and really dissecting the players that are going to be involved. So we're going to kind of pick his brain here about how he's thought the draft process has gone, and then really shift that conversation to a fantasy perspective, because he is in our league too. So he will be making sure that he's keeping good notes, just like Vandy and Matt are probably doing right now, in terms of the guys that they're looking out for in that 2023 fantasy MLR draft. So stay in tune for that. That will be coming out on Friday. But before that, obviously, we got to give you a little preview here. So let's dive right into this preview. The biggest thing here is we got to talk about this draft order. We just talked about the trade that happened between NOLA and DC. NOLA moving up in that first round. Just a little bit of a kind of overarching idea of how this draft is operating. We got the Dallas Jackals having finished last season, they get that first overall pick, and then that's followed by NOLA. Dallas has, I think, the most picks in this MLR Collegiate Draft. If I'm doing my math correctly, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 overall picks in this draft. There's a really good article on Rugby America's Rugby News that breaks down the whole collegiate draft here, and 7 picks by Dallas. That is, I believe, the most in, like I said, for the entire draft. And there's going to be 3 rounds. NOLA has 3 first-round picks. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with that. And for those of you that were interested in terms of how these draft selections were picked, I know a lot of you already know this, but for those of you who are just getting into the MLR, initially before the MLR had selected the draft order in terms of how these teams finished in the regular season, but now they are taking into account the postseason finish as well. So we're going to be seeing New York with the final pick in the first round, followed by or just behind Seattle, who was in the finals, and so on and so forth. Some fun little interesting tidbits when it comes to this draft. 174 draft prospects have made their names eligible for Thursday night's draft, as opposed compared to at least the 2021 MLR draft. There were 168 names, so good to see a slight little uptick here. Some more younger talent really declaring their names for the MLR draft, getting interested in joining the professional league here stateside. And just for some to clarify some of the conversations that we were having last week in terms of how and who is eligible and how this all operates, we went to a conversation about how, players that don't declare then end up signing for teams. We had that whole fiasco during this past season where 2 players from St. Mary's, Peyton Taleo Alalio and Ronan Murphy, both signed with the Austin Gilgronis like midway through the season. I believe they just needed to wait out this period of post-draft when they decided not to declare for the draft, and then ended up becoming full-on free agents, and they were able to sign halfway through the 2022 season. A lot of people didn't like that. A lot of people, especially, you've heard the opinions of my brother, Matt and Vandy as well, of how they feel that that was a quote unquote loophole that you could take advantage of. But now going in to this year's MLR draft, players who are eligible but opt out of the draft must miss the entire 2023 season. Again, that was a reversal from the midseason rule that was put in place the season before that. But I should note that the MLR does have the power to grant exceptions to certain signings and certain players, whatever that means, on a case-by-case basis. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of operates. Again, I'm not sure that exactly addresses the problem fully, but I think it does deter players somewhat from not declaring for the draft and trying to use the free agency period as a way to go to the team that they want to go to, which is exactly opposite of what this draft is trying to do. And again, it is part of the discussion of this interesting dynamic between having both a draft and a youth development system that we talked a lot about in episode 30 of the Fantasy Ruckers show. So so let's talk about the actual draft itself and the players that you may see and the storylines that are coming out of this draft that we think that you need to look out for when it comes to a fantasy rugby lens, because I think that's what's important. As you start to dive in to the world of fantasy rugby, really starting to get into this thing, you start to view the game in a completely different way. And the way that you just view rugby as a rugby fan versus rugby or the MLR as a fantasy manager, completely different. So you're going to have both those caps. If you're both an MLR fan and a fantasy fan, you're going to have both those caps on Thursday night to kind of think with a clear lens and think with an unbiased opinion based on your fandomship and also what's best for a fantasy strategy going forward. So the way that we're going to do this is I got to give another shout out to Rugby Morning, again, coming out with the great content, and there have been mock drafts all over the place on socials about this MLR draft, but I got to give a shout out to the guy that's in our league that is, again, punching out some great content here. And we're going to use his mock draft as kind of a framework here to kind of explain what players you can see, what players that you may need to look out for, and then again, just using that as a way to format the way that you should be approaching this collegiate draft in terms of what it's going to be important for you in a fantasy kind of landscape. So looked at this mock draft, had a discussion with Rugby Morning about it. Again, he will be on Friday's show to explain his thought process here and also see where, maybe he was right and maybe, of course, where he was wrong too, and how he kind of worked that all out. So we're gonna break that down on Friday's show. But there were a lot of storylines that I got out of reading this mock draft. We're just gonna break down kind of the first round here. There's a lot of other names that we can go down the list, but we gotta leave a little bit up to mystery when it comes to Thursday night's draft. So let's break it down here. Some of the storylines that I got coming out of this mock draft and seeing a bunch of mock draft is that no one knows where anyone is going to go outside of the first overall pick. I don't think anyone has an idea. People can guess, people can make assumptions, and I guess it's kind of similar to any mock drafts in any sport. We always see this kind of mock draft season where people are lacking for MLR content, NFL content, what have you, and obviously all these articles come out with these mock drafts that end up being completely not even close, but it is a good brain teaser and it is a good brain exercise to kind of figure out, what our team needs, what are players fit in certain organizations and things like that. So I think there is some value to be had, but again, take everything here with a little bit of grain of salt, because comparing mock drafts to mock drafts, people have players going in all different places. The only thing that I think I can confidently say about Thursday's 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft is that we know who's going first overall, and that is going to be Sam Gola. He played lock with the Cal Bears. He did also have back row experience there as well. He's a Rudy Schultz Award finalist. That's essentially the Heisman of U.S. Collegiate Rugby. He captained the Bears in their undefeated 2022 season, falling short to St. Mary's in the Western Conference Final, who went on to play Army West Point. Big dude, 6'4", 245 pounds at least. And every single mock draft that I have seen has Sam Gola going to the Dallas Jackals with that first overall pick. He's the clear-cut favorite, of course, being that Rudy Schultz Award finalist. I think he's going to make that transition. I don't think we're going to see him as much of in that second row position in the MLR. I think he's going to retake that back row position when he moves up to the Dallas Jackals. However, that does bring the interesting conversation. If you guys saw the teasers in some of our social posts, or the conversation we had about positional breakdown and the positional importance, and our conversation about locks and second rows and their impact when it comes to fantasy scoring, Maddie learning the hard way that he did very well at selecting second row players when it comes to his fantasy draft. I think selecting a number of the top guys that we spoke about in that deep dive stats episode. But we also came to the realization that the second row doesn't really have that much opportunity from a fantasy perspective to really make an impact, and that is not where you're going to be earning a bulk of your points, or at least having an advantage over your team that you're playing in that week's matchup when it comes to the difference in points between certain second row players. Now, Sam Gola could be the anomaly. He could become a Reichard Hadding, where he's a second row player that is just blowing everyone out of the water, scoring points at that second row position, which would be a tremendous acquisition for any fantasy manager, because we kind of give it a comparison to the tight end in football. If any of you are fantasy football players out there, is that there's a quick drop off where you have a select few top guys at that position, and then after that it's slim pickings. So I think, the second row position, there's no drop off. It's just slim pickings, period. The advantage, like I said, isn't that high with those top level guys. But Sam Gola being a guy that has second row experience, who's also a top tier athlete, I don't think the question is whether or not he can do it. It's whether the position is going to allow him to do it, which goes to my point of being, I'm not as worried about it because I think he is going to switch over to that back row position, which again will have a lot more opportunity at scoring fantasy points, making a fantasy impact. Hokie from our league made the point when he appeared on our show that you really want those spine position guys when it comes to fantasy rugby, at least in the format that we have it as of right now, when it comes to the heavy reliance and the volatility of try scoring, which did have the most significant impact in our fantasy league this past season. So if he is at that back row position, I believe he played blindside flanker before moving to that second row with the Cal Bears. If he's with there at the blindside flanker position, or even better, if he, who knows? Maybe he moves to the 8-man position. I don't think they'll do that with the Dallas Jackals when they have I believe it is. Forget who's at the 8-man position for them. I'm just pulling it up here. Adrian Boyson played a bunch at that number 8 position. So yeah, who knows? Maybe Gola can come in there and take over that back row position, which we would love to see, and the fantasy impact and the fantasy value would just skyrocket with him. But again, like I said, the only sure thing here is that I think Sam Gola will be going to the Dallas Jackals. I think it would be a great pick for them. He's a guy that captained the Cal Bears team side, has those leadership qualities. The Dallas Jackals are trying to build an organization, being a team that has just entered the league, trying to build that culture, trying to build that foundation when it comes to what it means to be a Dallas Jackal. And if they can bring in a guy like Sam Gola that has that leadership experience, has that success from at least a collegiate level, he should be able to translate that over to the Dallas Jackals, help them grow their program, and then ultimately see whether or not he can make a fantasy impact. So the large thing being there, I think if he's at the back row, he'll have a much bigger fantasy impact. If he stays at that second row, not so much. But again, if he's as good as he says he is, and he gets the opportunity at that second row position, which is a very, very big if, we'll have to see whether or not he is a big fantasy contributor this upcoming year. It'll be interesting to see where he goes in our 2023 fantasy MLR draft, because we have had guys pick rookies pretty early, but I think more of those being back position guys, not so much forwards. So we'll see whether or not Sam Gola breaks the trend there. And then just going down the list here, another storyline that I really noticed when it came to the mock draft of Rugby Morning has, and again, you can check his mock draft out on Twitter at Rugby Morning, or subscribe to his email because he did release it there as well. You can do that at rugbymorning.com. He has, I believe, coming up next with the NOLA Gold, picking up Gabe Kettering, and he's a prop from Lindenwood University. And then coming after that is DC's pick, and he has them picking Kakoy Nelligan, who's a hooker from West Point. And then following that, you got Utah picking Jack Manzo, the hooker from the Cal Bears. And I think the interesting tidbit when I get from that, the storyline that I'm looking for there, is we've seen the moves that the Utah Warriors had been making, right? They went on and to acquire Andrew Quattrin. We thought he was going to be the replacement for retiring Chad Go at that hooker position for the Utah Warriors. But lo and behold, less than a week later, they're shipping him off to New England, I believe, for salary cap considerations. I believe the end up net kind of handoff with that trade was that the Utah Warriors gave up a international roster spot to the Toronto Arrows, and then ultimately receiving from the New England Free Jacks additional salary cap space for them to use. And what that really dictates to me here is I agree with Rugby Morning here. They are going to be hunting down a hooker. And I think the biggest question here is, which hooker are they going to get? And there's a big conversation between the two top hookers in this draft. I think a lot of people are pointing at Kakoy Nelligan as being one of those guys, and then Jack Manzo, who Rugby Morning has them selecting. I've read a bunch of different articles, a bunch of different opinions on Jack Manzo. I think the large overlying opinion is that he is arguably the best at the position, best at the hooker position. He captained the Eagles U23 side, has that collegiate success along playing with Sam Gola at Cal Bears. So, they could go with him if he falls to him. But then we also have Kakoy Nelligan. He has a little bit of more versatility. He's coming from Army West Point, winning the collegiate championship there. He has played flanker in college as well, so he has that kind of hybrid, diverse kind of utilization that he can have. So I think another big storyline that I'm getting out of this is that who is Utah going to get? Is Nola targeting one of those hookers? Not too sure. If not, then they should have pickings depending on obviously what DC does at that fourth spot. But I think regardless, at that fourth spot, if either of those two players are there, they are going to be going with one of those hookers, and it's just a question of which one it's going to be. Because I think with all those off-season moves that they made already, it's only telling that is the direction that they're going to go with. And that's what I was talking about before. You kind of got to read between the lines here, read between those roster moves, those trades that they're making. You can kind of get a sense of how they're kind of approaching this year's collegiate draft. And you're going down the list, and this is where it starts to get a little bit, iffy in terms of, the players that people have at certain spots. I don't really want to get into all of it because I think it's just a lot of, feel and personal opinion in terms of where you think these players slot in the team needs and certain things like that. And I've been comparing mock draft to mock draft to mock draft, and it's not, like a lot of power four sports, in terms of NFL, NHL, where there's a general consensus of, a guy will go plus or minus 3 spots in terms of it. The MLR mock drafts are all over the place. We got guys going in the first 5 picks, the guys not even being in the first round. A whole lot of volatility, just like fantasy rugby. So I'd expect no less. So, just expect that I think a lot of people don't really necessarily know where teams are going with this outside of kind of those top players. Even for Kakoy Nelligan and Jack Manzo, the 2 top hookers, they're not even, in some people's top 5 and in other people's mock drafts as well. So even from that standpoint, there's still a lot of questions and gray area in terms of where these guys are going. Like I said, the only real definitive thing seems to be that Sam Gola is going number 1. The only reason why I'm really talking about Kakoy Nelligan and Jack Manzo being in that top 5 pick is because of Utah's need to get a hooker. That's all I'm going off of. So we'll see whether or not that falls. But just looking at the players that Rugby Morning has gone through and just trying to peel out kind of some storylines that you can watch out for in addition to Utah being the hooker, seeing that, players are really going in any different position. There's also this thing where Nola has 3 first-round picks. So I think another storyline here is going to be very, very interesting to see where or how they use these picks and what direction they're going to go to. Kind of to the point that I mentioned earlier in the show, in the Ask TFR show question, are teams going with the best player available? Are they going with positional need? We don't know that yet. We don't really know what the I shouldn't say what teams are leaning towards every single time, because obviously it's going to differ from organization to organization. However, kind of the underlying consensus, the underlying rule of how to approach this draft, and it'll be interesting to see how Nola approaches it. Does a guy fall to them? I mean, they have a really good chance having those 3 picks. They're going to get the guy that they want at that 2 spot, but sitting with back-to-back picks at that 6 and 7, they're going to have a nice little choice of the players that they want at that selection. So it'll be interesting to see what the Golds kind of step away with regards to that. So I think those were the big storylines coming out. And again, you just keep an eye out for these players. Do some research about them. We have some pretty cool names coming through the ranks, and I think you're going to get a lot more familiar with these names as we go on through this offseason, talk about their fits with these teams. And then that's going to lend ourselves to really dive deeper into how these players are going to make a fantasy impact. Because like I said, and like I continue to emphasize, I know certain fantasy managers are going to disagree on the emphasis that you put on this, but I am a firm believer that it's not all about where these players go, or excuse me, it's not about, where these players are coming from, how good they are on paper. Obviously, that does have a factor into it, but I think a big thing coming out when it comes to fantasy rugby is really looking at the situation that they're bringing themselves into. The best way that I can kind of relate it to, for those of you who are new to the MLR and maybe watch some other sports, is, we could talk about the best quarterback in the NFL or the best quarterback in football coming out in a draft, but where they get drafted to, the organization that picks them up, the organization of how they operate in terms of the fit of those certain players, the culture, all these different dynamics, I think really play into how much of a ceiling that these certain players can achieve, especially from a fantasy perspective standpoint. So really keep an eye out for that. So you may see, Kakoy Nelligan or Jack Manzo going to certain spots. And yes, maybe Jack Manzo is, considered for some as the best at that specific position. But if Manzo ends up being on a team that doesn't have, maybe they already have a hooker and he's going to be subbing in at that halfway point, or, wherever Kakoy Nelligan goes, he goes to a team that doesn't have a hooker like Utah. Maybe he's playing more of a 70 minutes per match where you're getting that extra bonus point. Certain factors like that are things that fantasy managers, specifically fantasy managers, again, I want to emphasize that this is not about building just rugby teams. We're now looking through this in a fantasy lens, is that those types of factors, those types of things are going to be what fantasy managers need to look out for. And despite certain players maybe be better on paper, like I said, the situation is going to really dictate, in my opinion, how these players are going to perform in the 2023 fantasy season. So yeah, just a quick little overview of kind of what to expect in this 2022 MLR Collegiate Draft. Couldn't be more excited for it. Again, we're going to break the entire draft down, where the players go, how that affects fantasy, what we think it means for certain teams, what it means for performances in terms of fantasy performance in those certain spots. It's going to be really interesting to see where these players go. And again, it's super exciting because this is part of the next wave of familiar faces, young stud talent that's going to come through the league that I'm sure, like players like Penny Lasaka, or excuse me, not Penny Lasaka, it's like Vito Petty, who won Rookie of the Year last year. They're going to be players like that, and it's just all about these fantasy managers really picking out and trying to find those tidbits that kind of lean you towards those directions. So hey, that some of you could select potentially the next Rookie of the Year that will have a massive fantasy impact for your squad in the 2023 year. Just to kind of emphasize the impact that is possible for some of these rookers. Vito Petty, or for some of these rookies, Vito Petty finishing 44th in the entirety of the fantasy rugby standings with 46.9 fantasy points for Seattle. He was selected in the sixth round. The middle of the tail end of the sixth round in the 2022 draft. So he did fall a little bit. That someone had to take a risk on him, and it was Rugby Morning, inevitably, obviously, who seems to be the guru when it comes to college players in the U.S. Apparently, and he was able to scoop him up. So I'm sure a bunch of fantasy managers this season are going to look for that next Vito Petty. But yeah, so much stuff to look forward to this week. Again, draft Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Fox Sports 2. Make sure you're tuning in. We're going to find some interesting tidbits and nuggets when it comes to who is going to be a big-time rookie in the fantasy rugby landscape. And then again, I'll mention it, Friday, we're going to break it all down. You won't want to miss it. Rugby Morning, Fitzy is coming on the show to break it all down, talk about the draft, talk about what it means for fantasy rugby. It's going to be an awesome time. So with that being said, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, for Matt Yee, I'm Ryan. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Hopefully you're all excited for the draft just like we are, and we will see you on Friday.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.